Thanks very much, Pak Setiadi. Unlike Pak Setiadi, I haven't run 4 marathons, so I'm not as fit, so I hope you excuse me if I sit down and speak to you instead. But good afternoon. Very happy to see everyone here, and thank you again to Pak Setiadi and to the IBC for inviting the Singapore Embassy in Jakarta to sort of speak to all of you. First off, what I wanted to do really is to convey the regrets of my ambassador, Mr. Anil Kumar Nair. He's unfortunately out of Indonesia right now, otherwise he would have loved to have been here. He came for this event last year and a few years back as well. And I was telling Pak Seti as well, normally when the ambassador is out of town, the number 2 has to stay in town, right? But we decided that this event was important enough for us to make a bit of an exception, which is why I'm here in Bandung with you today. So I think my ambassador also has sent his congratulations to the IBC on your 16th anniversary, and he hopes that the IBC will continue to play an important role in promoting stronger ties between Singapore and Indonesian businesses through events like this forum and through events and activities like those that Pak Seti spoke about earlier. Very ambitious list of events for the next 8 years, but undoubtedly achievable, I think, under your leadership and with the support of everybody around the table here. So I've been asked actually to speak, briefly, to share some views or to give you an overview of Singapore-Indonesia bilateral relations at the start of the ASEAN Economic Community. So what I was thinking of doing is to start maybe by talking about sort of where we are, where Singapore and Indonesia are in the world, how I see sort of global situation right now very briefly, what ASEAN's response to that has been, in other words, sort of what some of the thinking is behind the conceptualization of this thing called the ASEAN Economic Community, and then from there move into sort of what Singapore and Indonesia are doing, as well as some opportunities that we see for Singapore and Indonesia businesses as well. Of course, I'm not a businessman, I don't work in the private sector, so I ask to be excused if I sort of don't cover too much on some of the technical details and try and keep my remarks as brief and general as possible. So where are we today in the world? I think we were just talking over lunch about sort of the global economic conditions and how the outlook for the world, at least this year, global economies is a bit sort of uncertain, unstable, potentially even some people say a bit grim. I think that's one of the results of where we are today, but we are also in a very globalized world, right? Globalization is not a new concept to us. The term was first coined in the 1980s, but the concept itself stretches back centuries if you count sort of the trading empires built by the old European powers. I mean, the English, the Dutch here in Indonesia, Spain, Portugal, and so on. I mean, some people have said that, actually an example of globalization, I'll come to that in a second. Some people would say that the world was globalized about 100 years ago, as globalized 100 years ago as it is today with international trade and migration. I mean, just look at this region, Southeast Asia, where merchants and traders have plied the sea routes between the straits, across the Straits of Malacca and the Java Sea for centuries. Some people may not know this, but many Singaporean families actually trace their ancestry to different parts of Indonesia, whether Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi even. Singapore's first president, for example, Mr. Yusof Ishak, right, was actually of Minangkabau descent, so from Sumatra itself. So the ties are there, the existence, I mean, these links have been there regionally and globally. Now, today, what we see as the engines of globalization are foreign investment, information technology, modern transport and communications, mass media, multinational corporations, science and technology, and the international finance system. So the net effect of all these sort of drivers and forces has been to make the world both larger and smaller at the same time. Right? Two slightly contradictory ideas, but what do I mean by larger? Well, in a globalized environment, politicians, for one, now have no choice but to address sort of transnational challenges. They can't just focus on domestic issues in their own countries. Companies have to think sort of in terms of regional global markets. I don't think it's enough for any company to really look at just what's happening in that country where they do their operations only because of the finance flows, because of the markets that they have. And for individuals as well, more and more people are traveling, more and more people are experiencing different things. You can sort of go online, right? Make a phone call to someone very cheaply, some halfway across the world. right? People are developing a more international, more global outlook as well. That's how the world's getting a bit larger. But it's also getting a bit smaller in the sense that events in one country now can and do have very significant effects on another country, even if that country is halfway around the world. We've seen this over the past few years: the global financial crisis, the Arab Spring, health pandemics, social tensions even, terrorism, for example, and religious fundamentalism, even sort of protectionist nationalism, right? All these things that happen in one country do have an impact on the neighbors of that country as well as the wider region and the wider world as well. Not to say that there aren't opportunities, and I think over the last 2 decades, Asia as a whole, Asia as the countries, especially East Asia, have been very successful in sort of reaping the growth and opportunities of a more interconnected and more interdependent world. Now, Southeast Asia as well, the part of the world we live in, right, I think countries have progressed quite steadily, especially after recovering from the Asian financial crisis in 1997, 1998. But at the same time, what happened, I think, with the end of the Cold War, with sort of changes to the world after the Asian financial crisis in the early to mid-2000s, was that many of the ASEAN members at the time recognized that more needed to be done for these countries, these 10 countries that made up ASEAN, to do more together to be able to sort of face the competitions, face the challenges that lay ahead. Now, some of the thinking: number one, some of the largest challenges faced by nations like terrorism and pandemics, transnational in nature, as I mentioned, and they can't be resolved by individual states alone, but they have to be sort of tackled by different countries acting together. Whether large countries, small countries, everyone has to come together. Second, number two, the geopolitical landscape, where in the Cold War it was very much a bipolar world. You had the Soviet Union on one side, you had the US on the other. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, so on and so forth, what we had was, some people call it a unipolar world with the dominance of the US. Some people have referred to it as sort of a multipolar world. The net effect of all of this is that the world became far more complex, far more difficult, far more uncertain, far more challenging. Number three, I think the leaders of ASEAN, including our countries, saw that India and China were developing at a pace that was unprecedented. I mean, I think everyone knows about the Chinese story. India, after its liberalization in the 1990s, was similarly moving very, very fast as well. And each of the individual leaders of ASEAN looked at these two sort of giants and said, hey, what's going to happen to us if they exert centrifugal forces on Southeast Asia? Even today, China and India are changing the landscape in unthought of ways, unheard of ways. We don't know what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and this feeds back into the uncertainty. So the ASEAN leaders in the mid-2000s decided the way forward to address this for all our countries, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and so on, right, was really to speed up, enhance regional integration, bring Southeast Asia together. Now, individually, you say Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, 250, 260 million people, right? Singapore, 5.5 million. Even 250 million people, when you compare that to the size of China, the size of India, the markets that they have, the resources that they can bring to bear, right? What does that mean? Can you effectively compete? So instead, the thinking was, let's bring ASEAN together, about 600 million people, economy, a combined economy, the size of about just under $2 trillion US. Now, with that, maybe we have a chance, right, together within ASEAN. And that basically was how the AEC was formed. Now, what does the AEC, what is the AEC meant to sort of do? Number one, it's supposed to enhance the free flow of trade and investment in the region itself, so making it easier to do business by establishing a single market and production base. Number two, it's meant to sort of help ASEAN become a highly competitive economic region, and one that promotes equitable economic development across different countries in ASEAN as well. Number four, the idea is through regional integration among the countries in ASEAN, right, we also try and integrate ASEAN into the wider sort of economic flows in the world. So despite slow global growth over the past couple of years, I think ASEAN has sustained very positive economic growth over the last 20 years. In fact, the region has grown at an average of 6% compared to the global average of 4% in the past decade. So, well, experts have estimated that with the continued growth of the middle class in ASEAN countries, ASEAN could become the 4th largest single market in the world by 2030. So this is after the EU, after the US, and after China. And ASEAN's combined GDP could rise more than 5-fold to US 10 trillion by 2030, the same year as well. So what does this mean for Singapore and Indonesia within ASEAN? Right? Naturally, there are some very clear differences between Singapore and Indonesia, given the size of the two countries, the population size as well as the way that we pursued sort of development and economic development so far. Of course, Indonesia is blessed with some natural resources that Singapore isn't, for example. But the important thing, from at least the way I see it, is that there are many opportunities to sort of enhance cooperation between Singapore and Indonesia, both bilaterally as well as within the framework of ASEAN. What should we do? We should try and address common challenges together and try and help both countries, both peoples actually prosper. Now, I think it shouldn't be news to any of you that Singapore and Indonesia actually share very long-standing, very intimate ties, spanning the political, the economic, social-cultural realms, right? To give you an example, we look at sort of trade, investment, tourism numbers. In 2015, Singapore was again Indonesia's #1 top investor, with total investment worth about US $5.9 billion. This was slightly higher than the year before, 2014, where Singapore was also the #1 investor in Indonesia, but with US $5.8 billion. Bilateral trade has been steady, has been growing over the years, about 60 billion Singapore dollars last year. Right? Both Singapore and Indonesia are major trading partners for each other, understandably so given how close the two countries are and given the complementarities in our economies. But since coming to Indonesia, the statistic that really has surprised me the most is how Singapore and Indonesia are each other's top source of tourism arrivals. In 2015, there were about Singapore welcomed 2.7 million visitor arrivals from Indonesia, while Indonesia welcomed about 1.5 million visitor arrivals from Singapore. Of course, not all Singaporeans, there are only about 3 million Singaporeans, so not half of all Singaporeans visited Indonesia. But again, it shows how close the countries are, and it shows how tight the ties are, the connectivities are, the complementarities in the two economies. So what should we do? I think we should continue to build on these complementarities, deepen bilateral ties, support ASEAN's efforts towards regional integration. Some signs that this is already continuing. According to BKPM, the Indonesia Investment Coordinating Board, in the first few months of 2016, Singapore investment into Indonesia reached about 2.1 billion. So moving forward, getting there, some of these things already sort of continuing, right? What are some of these complementarities that I've been talking about? Well, I think Indonesia offers for Singapore businesses the advantages of its size, of its geography and demographics, how its companies have market reach, as well as Indonesia's own talented, intelligent human resources. Now, what does Singapore offer, or Singapore companies offer to Indonesia? I think we have sort of a competitive advantage in terms of capital, technology, skills and expertise that we can sort of are happy to share with our neighbors as well, right? So how has this sort of manifested so far? I wanted to share with you some examples from sort of Bandung and West Java that are going on right now. At the government-to-government level, Singapore and Bandung, we actually have quite a few sort of exchanges between civil servants, government officials on both sides. We share sort of our experiences, we exchange our views and how to sort of develop urban solutions for our populations, including public transport, one of the issues that the mayor of Bandung is very sort of seized by at the moment. Singapore government a few years ago has also started this initiative called the Smart Nation, really to prepare Singaporeans and Singapore companies to succeed in a more technologically advanced era. And Bandung itself as well similarly embarked on its own Smart City initiative and established the Bandung Digital Valley and Software Development Centers. So we have started to form sort of synergies to leverage on our shared interests in these areas. One example, as part of our Smart Nation effort, Singapore has established the ICT Global Talent Network, it's GTN, I think we call it. This basically aims to help Singapore companies based in Indonesia to collaborate with reputable Indonesian universities on talent development. So it's a win-win collaboration. Why? Because Singapore companies operating in Indonesia sometimes need access to this pool of talent that there is amongst Indonesians, right? And at the same time, these Singapore companies offer employment opportunities on the job training as well for Indonesians graduating from these universities with some of these skills. In March, a couple of months ago, the International Enterprise Singapore held a Singapore Career Day in 3 universities in Jakarta and Bandung: BINUS University, Telkom University, and the Bandung Institute of Technology, ITB, to reach out to these local students in Indonesia and inform them of the opportunity for knowledge and skills development. Now, one of the companies that participated in this exercise is called Equaria from Singapore, a Singapore e-government company which has set up a software development center in Bandung, Equaria Technologies Bandung, to really tap on this talent pool and try and sort of bring business opportunities as well as support what the Bandung government is trying to do in terms of its own e-government, in terms of its own IT development. So Singapore companies, from what I've been told, also interested in exploring potential avenues to participate in the development of Bandung's Technopolis. Singapore Semcorp Development, I think might be familiar to some of you, recently visited Bandung to explore the possibility of cooperation in this area. I suppose after the examples I've given, you might get the impression that a lot of the focus we have right now is on the ICT sort of field and all that, right? But I think Singapore companies are also, just looking at the companies around the table and talking to Basetti earlier, also still a lot of interest in traditional sectors, manufacturing, utilities, property, the traditional brick and mortar side of things as well. We have quite a few examples. My ambassador shared some of them last year, but again, over lunch, we were talking about, for example, franchises of sort of Singapore foods. Killarney Kopitiam, right, for the Singaporeans, has an outlet here which apparently serves the best ice cendol in Bandung, according to my friend from the Indonesian embassy in Singapore. So it's an example of how both sides have been working together. Of course, this is not all. We've been doing all this already, but what more can be done? Now, maybe I can share with you the perspectives of some Singapore companies that I've been speaking to, that I've met before. First of all, a lot of these companies tell me that they quite naturally look for stability in policy making, right? Growth figures, so on, that are positive. So in this regard, they are very sort of optimistic about Indonesia. Because of the improved growth levels that we expect this year in Indonesia, GDP growth, as well as the government sort of business-friendly initiatives that they've been rolling out over the past few months. I think these include sort of the 12 economic policy packages, President Jokowi's sort of emphasis on deregulation as well, so support business activity. Now, second, some of these companies, or all of these companies actually, are looking for legal and regulatory certainty. So this certainty is to, I heard a yes, but yes, this certainty is to provide not only sort of the confidence to make plans over the middle to longer term, but also the confidence to know that they are operating on a level playing field and that the laws in any place don't really favor one company or one sort of type of company over another. Now, a third sort of area that companies are looking at is the implementation of policies. And by implementation, I don't just mean at the national level, but also at the regional level, whether you see it at the provincial level, at the city level, or even the kabupaten, the regency level in Indonesia as well. I think these are 3 areas where Singapore Indonesian companies can really sort of sit down, discuss, talk about, explore further how they can work together to try and create this sort of, help create this environment for sort of more collaboration, for more partnerships as well. A fourth area that Singapore companies have spoken about, right, and underpinning maybe all the 3 areas that I spoke about earlier, is that they're looking at having Singapore and Indonesia having a very stable and positive bilateral relationship. So, so far, I think we've done fairly okay in that regard. We have, our strong cooperation really has allowed us to sort of address complex issues that may arise from time to time, as they do with all neighbors anyway. But the important thing is that the strength of the bilateral relationship has allowed both governments to sort of address these complex problems in a very constructive way. One example, obviously for me anyway, is how Singapore and Indonesia have basically settled both our maritime boundaries. I think anyone here who may have followed this in the news knows that boundaries or delimitation is one of the most complex, one of the most potentially controversial issues between any two countries. And very happy to say that since 2007, and then more recently 2014, right, both the eastern and western boundaries between Singapore and Indonesia have actually been resolved, and we were able to do this, well, in a very friendly manner, in a very constructive manner, partly because of the good links and the good sort of cooperation that already exists. So obviously our hope is that this will continue. So with Pak Dwi here, I think there's a good sign that both sides are committed to doing so, and I think this would be very helpful as well for companies or partnerships, business collaboration between Singapore and Indonesia. Now, I think I've spoken for quite long enough. Last thing I want to say before I stop speaking and stop boring you is to leave you with a quote from Singapore's founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Now, this was a quote from 1970, so just a few years after Singapore's independence, when Mr. Lee at the time was looking at how to develop the Singapore economy, what to focus on, what exactly to really do. Now, what he said, and I quote, "What I fear is complacency. When things always become better, people tend to want more for less work." So, let me go back to my earlier point about globalization. I think we live in a world today where things are, I think we can agree, indeed better in terms of our lives, in terms of what's available to us. Technology, innovation at our fingertips, no shortage of information or opportunities. These are the foundations, the way I see it, for a much stronger, better, more cooperative relationship, not just between Singapore and Indonesia, at the government level, but also between Singapore and Indonesian companies as well. And I think we all have a part to play in sort of trying to use these foundations that exist today and really sort of move things forward. Again, government to government level, or between businesses through sort of people like Pak Setiari as well. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Of course, if you have any sort of questions and all that, I'm very happy to take them. Thanks.